They say the truth always finds its way into the light, but sometimes it waits for the perfect moment to walk through the door. Jason Carter stood beneath the crystal chandeliers with the easy smile of a man convinced he had won. Tonight was supposed to be the final chapter of his past, the night he would celebrate his engagement to the woman he believed had upgraded every part of his life. Around him, champagne glasses clinked, cameras flashed, and guests whispered about his success, his charm, and the bright future waiting just ahead. Then he noticed someone standing near the entrance. Claire Bennett, the woman he had betrayed. The woman he had left behind without a second glance. The woman everyone expected to disappear quietly after their divorce. A slow wave of laughter spread across the room as curious eyes turned toward her. Some remembered how she had once stood beside Jason at events like this. Others only remembered the rumors that followed the divorce, rumors Jason had never bothered to correct because they made him look like the victim and made Claire look weak. His fiancée folded her arms with a confident smile, certain this awkward interruption would become another story proving they had won. Jason walked toward Claire with the kind of confidence only a man protected by his own lies could possess. His words were polite enough for the guests to hear, but sharp enough for Claire alone to understand. He asked if she had come to congratulate them or simply to remind herself of everything she had lost. A few people laughed. Others looked away, pretending not to notice the humiliation unfolding in front of them. Claire didn't answer. She didn't defend herself. She simply glanced toward the ballroom entrance as though she were waiting for someone who mattered far more than the opinions filling the room. Jason followed her gaze, amused by her silence. "Don't tell me you actually brought a date," he joked loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I suppose miracles really do happen." More laughter followed. Then the laughter stopped. The grand doors opened once again, and every conversation in the ballroom faded into silence. A tall man stepped inside wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to announce his importance. Before Jason could ask who he was, several executives abandoned their conversations. The chairman of the charity gala straightened his jacket. Two influential investors hurried forward. Even the event host looked suddenly nervous. One by one, the most powerful people in the room stood to greet the stranger with unmistakable respect. Jason's smile slowly disappeared. He searched the faces around him, hoping someone would explain why the atmosphere had changed so completely. Claire finally smiled for the first time that evening. Not with triumph, not with revenge, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already survived the worst day of her life. The stranger walked directly toward her, stopped only inches away, and gently offered his hand. Claire accepted it without hesitation. The room watched in stunned silence as he looked into her eyes and said 6 simple words that turned Jason's perfect night into the beginning of his greatest humiliation. "I'm sorry, I'm a little late." Claire Bennett had once believed that love was measured in quiet moments instead of grand promises. She believed it was found in early morning coffee shared across a kitchen counter, in long drives with no destination, and in the simple comfort of knowing someone would still choose you after seeing every imperfect part of your heart. When she married Jason Carter 7 years earlier, she thought she had found exactly that. Back then, Jason was ambitious without appearing ruthless. He spoke about building a future instead of chasing status. He laughed easily, dreamed boldly, and insisted that every success would mean nothing unless Claire stood beside him to celebrate it. They rented a modest apartment just outside downtown Chicago, where the walls were thin and the furniture came from secondhand stores, but neither of them seemed to care. Claire worked as an elementary school art teacher, while Jason spent long hours trying to grow a small consulting business that rarely turned a profit during its first years. Whenever doubt crept into his mind, Claire was always the one reminding him why he started. She stayed awake helping him prepare presentations, proofread proposals, and calm his fears before important meetings. When investors ignored him, she believed in him. When clients rejected him, she encouraged him to keep going. Jason often told people that he could never have built his company without Claire, and for a long time, she believed those words came from the deepest part of his heart. Then success arrived, slowly at first, and then all at once. One major contract became 3. 3 became 10. The company moved into a sleek office overlooking the Chicago River. Expensive dinners replaced homemade meals. Business trips replaced weekends together. Jason's phone never stopped ringing. But somehow he answered Claire's calls less and less. At first, she blamed the pressure. She told herself that every growing business demanded sacrifices. She smiled through canceled anniversaries, missed birthdays, and lonely evenings because she believed they were building something that would eventually give them more time together. Instead, the distance between them quietly became permanent. Jason no longer asked how her day had gone. He no longer noticed when she cut her hair or bought a new dress. Conversations turned into schedules, schedules turned into silence, and silence slowly became the loudest thing inside their home. The first time Claire sensed something had truly changed was during a charity fundraiser nearly 2 years before the divorce. Jason spent the entire evening introducing clients to a glamorous marketing executive named Vanessa Reed. Every time Claire walked toward them, the conversation ended. Jason would smile politely before suggesting she mingle with someone else while he discussed business. Claire tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling growing inside her because trust had always been the foundation of their marriage. She refused to become suspicious without reason. Weeks later, she noticed perfume she did not recognize lingering on Jason's jacket. Then came the late-night meetings that lasted until sunrise, unexplained weekends away, and messages that disappeared from his phone before she ever saw them. Even then, Claire never searched through his belongings or demanded answers. She wanted honesty that was freely given, not confessions dragged out by accusations. Unfortunately, honesty never came. It arrived instead as an accidental discovery one rainy Tuesday afternoon when Claire stopped by Jason's office carrying homemade soup because he had complained about feeling sick. His assistant looked startled to see her. The conference room door was slightly open. Inside, Jason and Vanessa were laughing together with a closeness that no marriage could mistake. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no broken furniture. Claire quietly placed the container of soup on the receptionist's desk and walked back into the rain without saying a single word. She waited until Jason came home that evening. When he saw the untouched soup container sitting on the kitchen counter, he understood exactly what had happened. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jason sighed, not with regret, but with exhaustion, as though keeping the truth hidden had simply become inconvenient. He admitted the relationship had been going on for months. He insisted it had started because they had grown apart. He claimed Claire no longer challenged him, no longer fit the life he was creating, no longer understood the circles he now moved in. Every sentence felt less like an apology and more like a performance designed to justify decisions he had already made. Claire listened quietly until he finished. Then she asked only one question. "When did you stop seeing me as your partner?" Jason looked away before answering in a voice almost cold enough to erase 7 years together. "Probably around the time I realized we wanted different futures." Those words echoed through Claire's mind long after the marriage ended. Not because she believed them, but because they revealed something she had refused to see. Jason had not changed overnight. Success had simply given him permission to become the man he had always wanted to be. Within weeks, he filed for divorce. Friends they had known for years gradually disappeared from Claire's life. Invitations stopped arriving. Mutual acquaintances repeated Jason's version of the story, describing the separation as a peaceful decision between two people who had simply drifted apart. Claire never corrected them. She did not compete for sympathy. She did not publish emotional messages online. She quietly moved into a small apartment on the north side of the city, returned to teaching full-time, and began learning what life sounded like after disappointment stopped making all the noise. She told herself that losing a marriage did not mean losing her worth. She repeated those words every morning until one day they finally sounded true. Then, almost 8 months after signing the divorce papers, an elegant ivory envelope arrived in her mailbox. Embossed in gold were 2 familiar names. Jason Carter and Vanessa Reed requested the honor of her presence at their engagement gala. Claire stared at the invitation for several silent minutes before placing it on the kitchen table. Most people would have thrown it away. Instead, she reached for her phone, opened a conversation that had remained surprisingly short over the past few months, and typed just 6 words. "Will you come with me that night?" I do not yet know whether Claire expected a reply, but she did not have to wait long. Less than a minute after sending the message, her phone vibrated once. "I will be there. Tell me the time." There were no questions, no hesitation, and no attempt to convince her to stay home. She stared at the screen for several seconds before placing the phone face down on the kitchen table. Somehow those simple words gave her more peace than every empty promise Jason had made during the final year of their marriage. The days leading up to the engagement gala passed quietly. Claire continued teaching her students how to mix colors and paint landscapes while pretending that another ordinary weekend was approaching. None of her co-workers knew she had been invited to the celebration. She preferred it that way. Sympathy was exhausting, and explanations were even worse. On Friday evening, she opened the back of her closet and carefully removed the navy blue evening dress she had not worn since before the divorce. It was elegant without demanding attention, timeless without trying to compete with fashion. For a brief moment, she wondered if wearing it would make her look like someone trying to reclaim the past. Then she realized something important. She was not dressing for Jason. She was dressing for herself. Saturday arrived with unusually clear skies. The downtown skyline shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun as luxury cars lined the entrance to the Grand Marlowe Hotel, one of Chicago's most exclusive event venues. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the marble lobby while a string quartet welcomed guests with familiar classical melodies. Everything about the evening was designed to celebrate success, prestige, and appearances. Jason loved places like this because they rewarded confidence before character. As guests stepped onto the red carpet, photographers captured smiling couples and polished executives who had perfected the art of looking successful. Jason stood near the ballroom entrance greeting investors, local business leaders, and longtime clients with effortless confidence. Vanessa remained beside him wearing an ivory designer gown that quickly became the center of attention. She accepted every compliment with practiced grace while quietly studying the room to see who mattered most. Jason felt completely in control. He believed this evening would confirm everything he had worked towards since ending his marriage. The business was thriving. His social circle admired him. His engagement symbolized a new beginning free from what he often described as unnecessary emotional baggage. More than once he joked that life became simpler after learning when to leave the past behind. The guests laughed because they only knew the version of the story Jason had chosen to tell. Shortly after 7 o'clock, Jason noticed several familiar faces from his former life entering the ballroom. Old neighbors, former colleagues, even a couple who had attended his wedding years earlier. They greeted him warmly, but before long someone asked a question he had hoped would never come. "Do you think Claire will be here tonight?" Jason smiled as though the answer could not possibly matter. "I doubt she would want to relive old memories," he replied with a casual shrug. "Besides, I think she finally realized we both ended up where we belonged." Vanessa squeezed his arm approvingly while the conversation moved on. Yet Jason glanced toward the entrance more often than he cared to admit. Part of him wanted Claire to stay away forever. Another part wanted her to witness how completely he believed he had moved on. At exactly 7:30, the ballroom doors opened once again. Claire stepped inside alone. She moved calmly through the entrance, neither rushing nor hesitating, her expression composed despite the dozens of curious eyes turning toward her. Conversations softened into whispers almost immediately. Some guests recognized her at once. Others quietly asked who she was before receiving whispered explanations that spread across the room like ripples across still water. Jason watched her approach with an unreadable smile. Vanessa leaned closer and whispered something that made him laugh softly. Claire noticed the reaction but kept walking until only a few feet separated them. Jason welcomed her with exaggerated politeness that felt colder than open hostility. "Claire," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I honestly did not think you would come." Claire returned the smile, gentle and controlled. "You invited me." "Out of courtesy," Jason answered lightly. Most people know those invitations are symbolic. A few nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances while pretending to admire the floral arrangements. Jason continued before Claire could respond. "I hope seeing everyone together is not too difficult for you. I would hate for old emotions to ruin your evening." Vanessa added with perfect manners. "We truly hope you find happiness too. Everyone deserves a second chance." The words sounded kind enough to anyone overhearing them, but Claire understood exactly what they meant. She was expected to stand quietly, congratulate the happy couple, and leave with her dignity barely intact. Instead of reacting, she simply looked around the ballroom as though searching for someone. Jason noticed immediately. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked with an amused grin. Claire answered with complete honesty. "Yes." Jason chuckled. "Well, I hope he actually shows up. It would be embarrassing otherwise." Several guests laughed politely, relieved to follow Jason's lead. Claire checked the time on her phone. 7:32. Her expression never changed. Jason folded his arms confidently. "You know," he said loud enough for nearby conversations to stop, "sometimes accepting the past is healthier than pretending it can be rewritten." Claire looked at him for a long moment before quietly replying, "Sometimes the past is not finished speaking." Jason frowned almost imperceptibly. Before he could answer, headlights swept across the hotel's grand entrance through the towering glass windows. One luxury sedan after another slowed to a stop outside, followed by a sleek black vehicle that none of the guests recognized. Yet the hotel's general manager suddenly hurried toward the front doors himself, straightening his tie with visible urgency. Claire slipped her phone back into her purse and took a slow breath as the ballroom, without understanding why, began to fall silent. The black sedan came to a smooth stop beneath the hotel's covered entrance, yet no one stepped out immediately. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but inside the ballroom it felt much longer. Conversations faded into uneasy silence as the hotel's general manager personally opened the rear passenger door, an honor normally reserved for guests whose influence reached far beyond a single company or social event. Jason watched with growing curiosity. He knew nearly every major executive attending that evening, yet he could not imagine who deserved such an extraordinary welcome. Then a polished black shoe appeared beneath the door, followed by a tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. There was nothing flashy about him. No oversized watch, no dramatic entrance, no bodyguards forcing people aside. His confidence came from something far quieter. It was the confidence of someone who never had to prove who he was because everyone else already knew. Ethan Blackwood adjusted the cuff of his jacket before thanking the general manager with a warm handshake rather than expecting formal treatment. Several employees smiled with genuine respect instead of nervous obligation. That small detail did not escape Claire. It reminded her why she trusted him. True character always revealed itself in moments no one expected others to notice. Jason narrowed his eyes as Ethan entered the lobby. The face seemed vaguely familiar, but he could not place it. Before he could think any further, two senior partners from one of the country's largest investment firms hurried across the ballroom to greet Ethan. Jason recognized both men immediately because he had spent nearly a year trying to schedule a meeting with them without success. They welcomed Ethan like an old friend, laughing naturally before introducing him to another group of executives waiting nearby. The room's energy shifted almost instantly. Guests who had been surrounding Jason only moments earlier slowly drifted toward the entrance, eager to exchange greetings with the newcomer. Vanessa frowned as she watched the unexpected movement. "Who is he?" she whispered. Jason forced a confident smile. Probably another investor trying to make an impression. Yet even as he spoke, he noticed something that made him uncomfortable. People were not trying to impress Ethan. They were hoping Ethan would remember them. Claire remained exactly where she was, her hands resting calmly in front of her. She never waved or called his name. She simply waited. Ethan finished greeting the people who had approached him before his eyes settled across the ballroom. The moment he saw Claire, his expression softened into a genuine smile. Without hesitation, he excused himself from the surrounding executives and walked directly toward her. Every step seemed to slow the room even further. Jason crossed his arms, determined not to reveal his growing irritation. Ethan stopped in front of Claire, offering his hand with quiet warmth. "I am sorry I am a little late," he said. "Traffic near the river was worse than expected." Claire smiled back. "You made it. That is all that matters." Instead of the formal handshake many expected, Ethan lightly squeezed her hand before releasing it, a simple gesture that reflected trust rather than performance. Jason let out a small laugh. "Claire, are you going to introduce your friend?" His tone remained pleasant enough for nearby guests, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. Claire turned toward Jason without losing her composure. "Jason, this is Ethan Blackwood." Jason nodded politely. "Nice to meet you." Ethan returned the greeting with equal courtesy. "Congratulations on your engagement." Jason searched Ethan's face for any sign of uncertainty and found none. Everything about him felt composed, measured, almost impossible to read. That calm confidence irritated Jason far more than open arrogance ever could. Vanessa stepped forward with a practiced smile. Claire mentioned she was bringing someone. We were beginning to wonder if she had changed her mind. Ethan answered before Claire could speak. I would never leave someone waiting when I promised I would be here. The sentence sounded ordinary, yet several nearby guests exchanged knowing glances, sensing a depth to the words they could not fully explain. Jason decided to reclaim the attention that had quietly slipped away. Well, he said with a light chuckle, I hope Claire has not filled your head with too many dramatic stories about our marriage. Divorces are rarely as one-sided as people like to believe. Ethan looked at Jason thoughtfully before replying. I have learned that every story has two versions. Sometimes there is also the truth waiting patiently between them. A brief silence followed. Nobody laughed this time. Jason felt the conversation slipping beyond his control, but before he could redirect it, an older gentleman approached Ethan carrying a glass of sparkling water. Jason recognized him immediately. Richard Holloway, founder of one of the Midwest's most respected financial institutions, and a man whose endorsement could transform an entire business. Richard smiled warmly at Ethan. I have been looking everywhere for you. The board wanted to know if you had arrived. Ethan accepted the greeting naturally. I promised I would join them later this evening. Richard then noticed Claire standing beside him. His face brightened even more. So this must be Claire. It is a pleasure to finally meet you. Ethan has spoken very highly of your kindness. Jason felt his heartbeat quicken. He had spent months trying to secure a single meeting with Richard Holloway, yet Richard was speaking to Ethan as though they had known each other for years. For the first time that evening, Jason realized he might not be looking at an ordinary guest after all. And somewhere across the ballroom, more than one executive quietly reached for a phone, eager to confirm whether the man standing beside Claire was exactly who they were beginning to suspect. The whispers spread through the ballroom faster than the music. One conversation became 5. 5 became 20. Guests who had spent the last hour praising Jason's latest business success suddenly found themselves watching Ethan Blackwood instead. Nobody wanted to ask the obvious question out loud because admitting they did not recognize someone so clearly important felt almost embarrassing. Jason noticed the change immediately. The people who had been laughing at his jokes only minutes earlier were now stealing glances toward Claire and the man standing beside her. It was subtle, but impossible to ignore. Status had its own gravity, and the room was slowly being pulled away from him. Jason forced himself to smile. It looks like your friend knows quite a few people, he said casually. Ethan answered with the same calm tone he had used since arriving. I have been fortunate to meet good people over the years. There was no boasting, no attempt to impress anyone. Somehow that made his answer even more unsettling. Jason had spent years carefully reminding people of every achievement his company earned. Ethan spoke as though influence was simply another ordinary part of life. Before Jason could continue the conversation, another familiar voice interrupted. Mr. Blackwood. Everyone turned to see Margaret Ellis, chairwoman of the Blackstone Children's Foundation, approaching with genuine excitement. She extended both hands toward Ethan. We have been hoping you could attend tonight. Your foundation's education initiative changed hundreds of lives across Illinois. Ethan greeted her warmly. The teachers deserve the credit. They are the ones changing lives every single day. Margaret smiled before looking toward Claire. And you must be Claire Bennett. Claire nodded politely. It is wonderful to finally meet you, Margaret continued. Ethan has mentioned your classroom more than once. The scholarship program you suggested has already helped dozens of students. Claire blinked with visible surprise. She looked at Ethan. You never told me they approved it. Ethan smiled gently. I wanted the children to benefit first. Recognition can always come later. Margaret excused herself after another warm handshake, leaving behind another wave of stunned silence. Vanessa watched the exchange with growing uncertainty. Earlier that evening, she had viewed Claire as someone returning to relive old heartbreak. Now Claire stood comfortably among people whose influence extended far beyond social appearances. It no longer looked like coincidence. Jason tried to recover the conversation before anyone noticed his discomfort. Claire has always enjoyed helping people, he said with a polite laugh. Although I never imagined she would have connections like these. Claire answered quietly. Neither did I. Her response carried no bitterness, only honesty. Jason studied Ethan more carefully. Something about the name continued to bother him. He had definitely heard it before. Then his business partner Daniel quietly stepped beside him, his expression noticeably tense. "Jason," he whispered, careful not to attract attention. "I think you should search his name." Jason frowned. "Now." Daniel discreetly held up his phone. The screen displayed a financial news article with Ethan's photograph beside the headline. Jason read only the first few lines before the colors slowly drained from his face. Ethan Blackwood was not simply another investor. He was the founder and chairman of Blackwood Strategic Holdings, a privately owned investment group with interests spanning technology, infrastructure, education, and healthcare across North America. Unlike many public billionaires, Ethan rarely appeared in interviews and almost never attended social events unless they supported charitable causes. Business publications often described him as one of the most influential executives most Americans would never recognize on the street. Jason stared at the screen in disbelief. His own company had unsuccessfully submitted partnership proposals to Blackwood Strategic Holdings twice during the previous 3 years. Neither application had received a response. Around them, more guests were quietly discovering the same information. Some glanced from their phones toward Ethan with widened eyes. Others suddenly remembered articles they had once read about the famously private businessman. The realization spread across the ballroom like electricity. Richard Holloway returned carrying another guest toward Ethan. "There you are," Richard said with a smile. "The Governor's Economic Advisory Committee has been asking whether you might accept next month's invitation." Ethan laughed softly. "I have not even answered last month's invitation yet." The small group shared an easy laugh born from genuine familiarity rather than social performance. Jason stood frozen. For years he had believed success meant becoming the most important person in every room. Tonight he was learning how quickly that illusion disappeared when someone carrying real influence quietly walked through the door. Claire noticed Jason watching them. She remembered another ballroom years earlier where she had stood alone while Jason introduced everyone else except his own wife. The memory no longer hurt the way it once had. Time had transformed pain into perspective. She no longer needed strangers to validate her worth because she had already rebuilt it herself. Ethan looked toward Claire as though sensing her thoughts without a single word being spoken. "Are you doing all right?" he asked softly. Claire smiled with complete sincerity. "Better than I ever imagined." Before either of them could say another word, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and smiled toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "before we celebrate tonight's engagement, we have an unexpected honor. We have just confirmed that one of this year's most generous anonymous benefactors has joined us this evening, and we would like to recognize him publicly for the very first time. Mr. Ethan Blackwood, would you please join us on stage?" For a brief moment, Ethan remained exactly where he was, almost as though he hoped the announcement had been intended for someone else. Then he looked toward Claire with a quiet smile that carried neither pride nor surprise. "Would you mind waiting for me?" he asked. Claire nodded. "Take your time." Ethan walked toward the stage as the audience instinctively stepped aside to make room for him. The applause began politely but quickly grew stronger as more guests recognized the significance of the moment. Jason remained frozen, unable to reconcile the calm man standing before him with the distant corporate figure whose name had appeared so often in financial magazines and investment reports. He had spent years chasing opportunities that ultimately depended on executives like Ethan, yet he had dismissed him as nothing more than Claire's companion only minutes earlier. The master of ceremonies greeted Ethan with sincere appreciation before addressing the audience once again. "Many of you know Mr. Blackwood for his remarkable business achievements, but very few know the impact he has quietly made outside the boardroom. Over the past 5 years, anonymous donations from the Blackwood Foundation have funded scholarships, children's hospitals, vocational training programs, and educational initiatives across the Midwest. Tonight, we are honored to recognize the person who has changed thousands of lives without asking for recognition in return." Another wave of applause filled the ballroom. Ethan accepted the Crystal Award with visible humility before stepping toward the microphone. He paused for a moment, looking across the audience as though carefully choosing every word. "Thank you for your kindness," he began. "I have always believed that success means very little unless it creates opportunities for someone else. Businesses can generate profits, but people create lasting change. Every teacher who encourages a struggling student, every volunteer who gives up a weekend to help a family, every mentor who believes in someone before the world does, those are the people who deserve applause tonight. The room became completely silent. Ethan continued, "Many people assume strength is measured by titles, wealth, or influence. I have learned something different. The strongest people are often those who rebuild their lives after disappointment without allowing bitterness to define who they become." Claire lowered her eyes, realizing those words were not accidental. Ethan was speaking to the entire room, but somehow he was also speaking directly to her. Several months ago, Ethan continued, "I met someone whose quiet resilience reminded me that dignity cannot be taken away by betrayal, failure, or public opinion. It can only be surrendered." She never asked for special treatment. She never complained about unfairness. Instead, she continued serving her community with compassion while rebuilding her own life one ordinary day at a time. Watching that journey changed my understanding of courage. Ethan turned his head toward Claire. Hundreds of eyes followed his gaze. Claire stood motionless, surprised by the attention she had never wanted. Ethan smiled warmly before finishing his thought. "That person is standing here tonight." The ballroom erupted into heartfelt applause. Claire instinctively shook her head, almost embarrassed by the recognition, but the applause continued. Several teachers attending the charity event smiled proudly after realizing she was being honored. Margaret Ellis rose to her feet first. Richard Holloway followed immediately afterward. Within seconds, nearly the entire ballroom was standing. Jason remained seated. Vanessa looked uncertain before slowly rising with everyone else. Jason noticed business partners, investors, and community leaders applauding the woman he had spent months describing as someone who had simply failed to keep up with his ambitions. Every version of the story he had carefully constructed suddenly felt painfully small. When the applause finally settled, Ethan stepped down from the stage instead of remaining in the spotlight. Rather than returning to the executives waiting to congratulate him, he walked directly back to Claire. He offered her the award. Claire looked confused. "This belongs to you," she whispered. Ethan gently shook his head. "It belongs to every person who reminded me why these programs mattered. You were one of them." Claire accepted the award carefully, her eyes reflecting gratitude rather than triumph. Jason watched the exchange in complete silence. For the first time since arriving, he understood something he had never considered during his marriage. Claire had never lacked value. He had simply stopped seeing it. Before he could gather his thoughts, Richard Holloway approached Ethan once more, accompanied by two members of the Blackwood Strategic Holdings executive board. Richard smiled toward Claire before turning to Jason with polite surprise. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I did not realize you and Claire knew each other. You must have been very fortunate to have shared part of her journey." The sentence was spoken with complete sincerity, yet it landed with more weight than any public accusation ever could. Jason tried to answer, but no words came. At that exact moment, one of his largest prospective clients quietly informed his assistant that he wished to postpone their meeting until further notice, choosing instead to introduce himself to Ethan Blackwood. Jason stood perfectly still, but inside, every certainty he had built over the past 2 years was beginning to collapse. Only an hour earlier, he had believed this gala would celebrate everything he had gained since ending his marriage. Instead, every conversation now seemed to revolve around Ethan Blackwood and the quiet woman Jason had once convinced himself was holding him back. Around the ballroom, executives who had barely acknowledged Claire upon her arrival now approached her with genuine respect. Teachers thanked her for inspiring scholarship programs they had only recently learned were connected to Ethan's foundation. Parents spoke about children whose lives had changed because classrooms received resources they never could have afforded before. Claire accepted every compliment with humility, always redirecting praise toward the educators and volunteers who had done the daily work. She never exaggerated her own role. Ethan noticed that about her from the very beginning. Jason remembered something very different. Years earlier, whenever his company reached an important milestone, Claire had always insisted that his employees receive the credit before he did. At the time, he viewed that attitude as a lack of ambition. Tonight, he suddenly wondered if it had actually been wisdom. Vanessa quietly stepped closer to Jason. "You never told me Claire worked with organizations like this." Jason answered honestly for the first time all evening. "I did not know. The realization stung more than he expected. During their marriage, he had become so focused on expanding his own world that he had stopped asking about hers. He knew quarterly revenue reports by memory, but could not remember the names of the students Claire used to talk about with excitement after long days at school. Success had not stolen his attention. He had willingly given it away. Across the ballroom, Richard Holloway introduced Ethan and Claire to another group of community leaders. One of them smiled warmly at Claire. Several principals still talk about the art program you designed after school. It has become a model for 3 different districts. Claire looked surprised. I only wanted children to have a safe place to create. Sometimes, the principal replied. Simple acts create the biggest changes. Jason lowered his eyes. During the final year of their marriage, he had complained more than once that Claire's teaching career lacked ambition because it would never make headlines or attract investors. Listening now, he finally understood how narrow his definition of success had become. The evening continued, but nothing unfolded the way Jason had imagined. A major client who had promised to discuss a future partnership approached Jason briefly with an apologetic expression. I think we should postpone our conversation until next quarter, he said politely. Our board has decided to reevaluate several strategic relationships. Jason forced a professional smile and wished him well, but he knew exactly what those carefully chosen words usually meant. The opportunity was gone. Not because Ethan had said anything against him. Ethan had not mentioned Jason's business even once. The room had simply witnessed enough to make people reconsider the kind of character they wanted beside their own reputation. That realization hurt more than open rejection ever could. Jason slowly walked toward Claire, who was standing alone near one of the ballroom windows, while Ethan spoke with several foundation trustees nearby. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The city lights reflected across the glass exactly as they had years earlier during another charity gala when they had attended as husband and wife. Finally, Jason broke the silence. I owe you an apology. Claire turned to face him calmly. She did not look angry. She simply looked peaceful. For what? She asked softly. Jason gave a quiet, almost defeated laugh. That is the problem. I do not think one apology covers everything. He looked toward the crowded ballroom before continuing. I spent so much time convincing myself that I had outgrown the life we built together that I stopped appreciating the person who helped build it with me. I told myself I deserved something bigger, something more impressive. Looking around tonight, I finally understand that I was measuring the wrong things. Claire listened without interrupting. Jason continued, his voice noticeably quieter than before. When I told people we wanted different futures, I believed it. Now I realize the truth was simpler. You kept becoming a better person, and I became someone who only cared about appearing successful. Claire looked at him with genuine compassion, not satisfaction. Jason, she said gently, everyone makes choices. Some build bridges. Others build walls. The important part is deciding what you will build next. Jason nodded slowly. He had expected anger, perhaps even humiliation. Instead, Claire offered him something far more difficult to accept. Grace. Ethan approached them at that moment, sensing the conversation had reached its natural end. Jason looked at him before speaking with complete sincerity. Take good care of her. Ethan answered with a respectful nod. She has never needed anyone to rescue her. She only deserves people who recognize her value. Jason accepted the truth without argument because, for the first time in years, he knew it was completely deserved. The gala slowly returned to its celebration, yet nothing about the evening felt the same. The elegant decorations, the music, and the carefully planned speeches remained exactly as they had been only hours earlier, but the atmosphere had changed in a way no event planner could have anticipated. People no longer measured the room by who stood closest to the stage or whose business card carried the most impressive title. They remembered the quiet teacher who had entered alone, endured whispered judgments without responding, and left surrounded not by applause she had sought, but by respect she had earned over many years of kindness. Claire looked around the ballroom one final time before quietly handing Ethan the crystal award. You should keep this, she said with a gentle smile. It belongs with the work you have done. Ethan shook his head. Awards belong on shelves. The lives they represent belong in the future. That is the part worth protecting. Claire smiled. You always know how to make complicated things sound simple. Ethan laughed softly. Only because you taught me that the simplest truths are usually the hardest ones to remember. Together they walked toward the ballroom exit, passing guests who stopped them only long enough to offer congratulations, gratitude, or quiet words of admiration. None of those conversations centered on wealth or influence. They centered on generosity, resilience, and hope. Claire realized something she had never expected. She no longer felt the need to explain her past to anyone. The woman who had once questioned her own worth after the divorce had disappeared long before this evening. She had been replaced by someone stronger, not because another person had saved her, but because she had slowly rebuilt herself one ordinary day at a time. Outside, the cool Chicago evening welcomed them with a light breeze flowing between the downtown buildings. The sounds of traffic blended with distant laughter drifting from nearby restaurants, reminding Claire that life continued whether a chapter ended in joy or disappointment. Ethan opened the passenger door of the sedan before turning toward her. "Would you like to get some coffee?" he asked. Claire smiled warmly. After a night like this, coffee sounds much better than another ballroom. Ethan laughed. "I was hoping you would say that." They climbed into the car, leaving behind the luxury hotel and everything it had represented only a few hours earlier. Inside the ballroom, Jason remained standing near the large windows overlooking the city. Vanessa quietly approached him before speaking. "Do you want to go home?" Jason looked across the lights reflecting on the river before answering. "In a minute." She nodded and walked away, sensing he needed a few moments alone. Jason watched the black sedan disappear into the evening traffic until its taillights blended with the thousands of others moving through the city. For the first time in many years, silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. He finally understood that the greatest mistake of his life had not been losing Claire. It had been failing to recognize her value while she was still standing beside him. Success had convinced him to chase admiration from strangers while quietly neglecting the loyalty that had carried him through his hardest years. Wealth had expanded his business, but pride had gradually emptied his heart. No public embarrassment could equal the private realization that he had traded something priceless for something temporary. Several months later, newspapers across Illinois published stories about a new statewide arts education initiative funded jointly by the Blackwood Foundation and local school districts. One photograph showed Claire standing beside dozens of smiling students as colorful murals filled the walls behind them. Another article highlighted Ethan's decision to expand scholarship opportunities into rural communities that rarely received major charitable investment. Neither interview mentioned the gala. Neither interview mentioned Jason. They focused entirely on the children whose futures had become brighter because two people chose to invest in others instead of dwelling on yesterday's disappointments. Jason saw one of those articles while drinking coffee before work one quiet Monday morning. He studied the photograph for several moments before folding the newspaper carefully and placing it back on the table. Instead of feeling envy, he felt gratitude that Claire had found the happiness he had once failed to protect. Some lessons arrive too late to change the past, but not too late to change the person who carries them into tomorrow. As the morning sun rose over the Chicago skyline, 3 different lives moved forward in 3 different directions. Claire walked into another classroom filled with children waiting to learn. Ethan prepared for another meeting where decisions would shape communities instead of headlines. Jason stepped into his office determined to build not only a stronger company, but a better character than the one he had left behind. Because in the end, the greatest victory was never watching someone else lose. It was becoming the kind of person who no longer needed revenge to feel complete.